Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be speaking to you about the North American water and power lines of the 21st century, as developed by LaRouchesupport over the last few years, and which will reestablish the sovereign nation-state system, launch a new revolution in economy, and a new industrialization of the planet as a whole by the effects which will develop by launching the system. This is a plan that was developed from the 1960s and has evolved since then, and especially been evolved since a recalculation, redevelopment, and a reconceptualization by LaRouchesupport. I'm going to be going through today some of the capabilities and requirements of the plan, as well as the breakdown of nuclear-powered pumping systems that the plan will require, and the updated water calculations, what this will mean for industry, and what this will mean for the new credit system. So what I want to start out with is just to say that there is no shortage of power, water, or food in the world, contrary to the Malthusian population reduction lines. We can have as much water as required, power to drive all the machinery, deliver all the water, and the only obstacle preventing that is the lack of sovereignty of nation states and a community of sovereign nations deciding to develop their own resources, and the greatest resource of all, the people themselves. It's only been the empire and its lackeys that have created these false dogmas of population reduction, scarcity of resources, as in Thomas Malthus, who was actually an economist for the British East India Company, and developed his argument, a phony, unscientific argument about food increase and population increase and the relation between the two, for the British East India Company. He was their economist and developed the argument as an apology for what the British East India Company was doing abroad, but especially in the effects on Ireland. Overpopulation, which is its own doctrine, is based on the idea that there's just not enough resources, not enough food, not enough water, and not enough energy. Now, all three of these are entirely false. When the sovereign nation state is capable of using the power of its own discoveries from its population and organizing its resources as a sovereign government to commit its resources to make successive breakthroughs and leaps in technologies. So the way in which this has been done over the preceding generations has overthrew the empire's false authority and, frankly, archaic traditions. This has been something which, as you can see here in a graph from 1780 all the way to the present, under the sovereign nation state, we don't lack any resources, since these new technologies drive the creation of new resources, increase of energy flux density, and increase of the capability to consume more and more resources, and making each time new technologies out of this new energy source, as the development of coal led to the ability of the trains and the steam locomotive and things like that. Now, this was something which, as you can see under Lincoln, the reestablishment of the full control over the sovereign government of the United States launched then a new willful leap in technological development and the application of everything that had been discovered. And Lincoln saw this as the development of a new era of expanded American population growth. And he said in December 3rd, 1861, his first inaugural address, he says, "From the first taking of our national census to the last are 70 years. We find our population at the end of the period 8 times as great as it was at the beginning. The increase of those other things which men deem desirable has been even greater. We thus have at one view that what the popular principle applied to government through the machinery of the states and the Union has produced in a given time, and also what if firmly maintained it promises for the future. There are already among us those who, if the Union be preserved, will live to see it contain 250 million people. The struggle of today is not altogether for today. It is for a vast future also. With a reliance on Providence all the more firm and earnest, let us proceed in the great task which events have devolved upon us. And what this means is that there would be people alive then, in 1861, who were, say, 2 years old. By the time they were 70 in 1930, we should have reached 250 million people. And we didn't reach that until 1990. Now, impossible, you say, that we could have had that kind of population growth. Well, what about the restrictions? But, in fact, that development was only blocked by British agents who took over, working in the Treasury Department, collapsing Lincoln's whole financial system and therefore collapsing the industrial economy along with it. Hugh McCulloch and David Wells and Lord Palmerston directing them from the British Empire. So it wasn't again until Roosevelt that we had a real development again. New technologies launched, another great leap, pushing the energy density also with the TVA to get the Oak Ridge National Laboratory that made the Manhattan Project possible, and harnessing the atom. So this was to be the next great evolution, surpassing the natural gas earlier that you saw. Natural gas and oil were leaping up also after the 1930s. But this was to be overleaped by nuclear power. And in that period, Kennedy himself also forecast the correct population growth rate that was occurring under the Roosevelt system of the correct relationship of the nation-state government and technology. All right. So then we look at John F. Kennedy and his forecast of population growth. And he says that we will triple the population of this country in the short space of 60 or 70 years. And we want those who come after us to have the same rich inheritance that we find now in the United States. So in his time, tripling the population by 2040 was getting to a population of 540 million. And today, 2013, we're at 313 million or so. And I'll show you this clip. The natural resource of our country,
particularly the land west of the 100th parallel, where the rain comes 15 or 20 inches a year. This state knows that the control of water is the secret of the development of the West. And whether we use it for power or for irrigation or for whatever purpose, no drop of water west of the 100th parallel should flow to the ocean without being used. And to do that requires the dedicated commitment of the people of the states of the West, working with the people of all the United States who have such an important equity in the richness of this part of the country. We will triple the population of this country in the short space of 60 or 70 years. And we want those who come after us to have the same rich inheritance that we find now in the United States. This is the reason for the trip. But it's not what I wanted to speak about tonight. I want to speak about the responsibility that I feel the United States has, not in this country, but abroad. And I see the closest interrelationship between the strength of the United States here at home and the strength of the United States around the world. There is one great natural development here in the United States which has had in its own way a greater effect upon the position and influence and prestige of the United States almost than any other act we've done. You know what it is? It's the Tennessee Valley. Nearly every leader of every new emerging country that comes to the United States wants to go to New York, to Washington, and the Tennessee Valley, because they want to see what we were able to do with the most poverty-ridden section of the United States in the short space of 30 years by the wise management of our resources. What happens here in this country affects the security of the United States and the cause of freedom.
So again, there has been since the assassination of John F. Kennedy and since the 70s, not only in the United States, but globally, there's been a decline of the growth rate of population. And we're headed down to slowly increase the world's population for a few more years, but then the total population to plummet by this intentional policy of reduction by the financial oligarchy in order for them to maintain control of the planet. And NAWAPA was stopped back then. Nuclear power was stopped by the oil hoax combined with Paul Volcker's interest rate spike, artificially collapsing the ability of industries and agriculture to make any credit agreements. So we submitted to Malthusianism and an ideology of fear of new assassinations, general economic subversion of sovereignty or the financial system, especially since 1971, the destruction of Bretton Woods, but then on, all to the present day, one subversion of national sovereignty over finances across the globe. And that for apparatus now has to simply be destroyed. There's nothing else to do except to destroy, just bluntly, the Malthusian doctrine. This doctrine has nothing to do with science. It has been intentional depopulation, and everybody who comes up with anti-nuclear technologies, the CO2 global warming scare, all of these doctrines you can trace back to the financial oligarchy, World Wildlife Fund, Nature Conservancy, all of the relatives of the British monarchy, and all of their lackeys who are pushing for their control over the world and population reduction as the way to get there. So all these myths of energy, food, water scarcity, and where there is a scarcity, it's created by these organizations opposing technology and development. All of those arguments have to simply be crushed. There can be no compromise with those doctrines. Any opposition to nuclear power cannot be answered with the great technological arguments of why this thing should proceed, or it's safe and it's efficient. That was tried with the integral fast reactor, and we could see that it was crushed, again, by the same groups in 1994. It was tried even earlier, and it was crushed, and it's been tried again to fit into the mold of the new climate change debate, and it will never proceed unless we crush these empire factions who are trying to slow and destroy population growth, and they've succeeded. We're on the trend. I'll bring up an image here on the screen. This is the trend. We're collapsing globally the population growth rate of the planet. Any opposition to water projects, water diversion, cannot be appeased by looking at how we're going to bring water to fish in the Southwest and increase the flows, or appeasing this stuff. We have to look at, we're overthrowing the entire paradigm that's been created by the empire. The development of technology and resource development for the evolution of mankind is what we're resuming, and that is the chief purpose for this. Now, what I want to get into is how we develop nations once again, that we have the power in our hands to resume this Kennedy-era, Roosevelt-era vision of the future. And the way to do it is to leap forward from the old original design of the NAWAPA project in the 1960s and leap forward to designs of nuclear reactors in the 60s and 70s and do as much advanced technology as we can, but in addition to that, to expand the program, and that's what we've done. We have greatly expanded and altered the original NAWAPA plan into NAWAPA 21. And that plan is not only uses nuclear power to drive the pump systems, but it also, with the help of engineer Hal Cooper, engineer Chuck Wojcik, and the Truckee Irrigation District in Fallon, Nevada, Ernie Schenck, and my own findings in the Frank Moss Archive, the senator who originally proposed this plan in the Senate with Senate Concurrent Resolution 55, we have added 4 new additions to the NAWAPA project. And I'm going to be going through those additions today and in detail seeing how the whole system's going to work and what all these tweaks, the new technologies that we're looking at, new mappings of it, figures, and then not to mention the new financing method with the establishment of the American credit system, all that adds up to NAWAPA 21. Now this is based on the idea, if you see here, 1,450 million acre-feet of total runoff for the Mackenzie Basin, the Yukon Basin, the other basins in British Columbia, the Columbia and the Fraser, the coastal basins, and then also the Columbia Basin. Yeah, as I said, all of these areas, Yukon, Alaska, and British Columbia, and then Washington State, add up to about 1,450 million acre-feet a year of runoff. The number is not so much important as is the comparison with the entire Southwest, Sacramento, San Joaquin, Colorado, Rio Grande, which is 32 million acre-feet of runoff. So it's actually 45 to 1. That's your ratio. And of that ratio, we're looking at taking less than 10%, 140.4 million acre-feet, as you'll see, drawn into actually not just the Southwest, but 10% of that drawn into the whole west of the Mississippi. Just that will transform the entire continent. So what I want to do now is review in detail the 6 main components of the plan, and also the nuclear power calculations, manufacturing calculations, and a rough estimate of what this means for the U.S. economy. So what I want to start with is the northern area of the collection system. This is if you look at this, this is actually the overview of the whole collection system. We're going to zero in on the top part, which is here up in Alaska and the Yukon River. There's 4 main rivers: Copper River, Susitna, Tanana, Yukon. Tanana being a tributary of the Yukon. These will be collected into the Yukon River and diverted south. And then with the Taku River, all of these rivers together are collected into this series of reservoirs, but then diverted south. And you can see here, these are the runoff amounts. Again, keep in mind the whole entire Southwest is only 32 million acre-feet of runoff. So you look at the runoff of these rivers, the Copper, Susitna, and the Yukon, and the Taku together. If we were to divert 20% of the normal runoff southward, runoff being the excess water that would normally just flow right into the ocean in excess of what's brought into the soil, etc., you get about 52 million acre-feet. So right here, with nuclear power then at the Taku lift, we can pump that water up into the Stickeen Reservoir. And just make a point to come back later, but here at Taku Reservoir, this is Juneau, Alaska down here, and the Juneau, Alaska, this is the capital of Alaska there, that's where you're going to have the ability to locate also desalinated water to bring into the system if we need more water later on. So the next part is the next 4 major rivers in northern British Columbia that we're going to look at. Up there you have the Taku River pumps into the Stickeen River Reservoir. So 3 major dams and a few other dams along with those in those valleys. The Stickeen, the Nass, and the Skeena rivers, which are right there on the coast, those rivers will also be dammed and then collect a portion of the water, 20%, which will continue south. And the Liard River, which is a tributary of the Mackenzie River, that river will also be dammed, and 20% of that river will feed into the system. So all of that will come south. And these rivers also, massive runoff, most of them by themselves, the total runoff of the Southwest. So 20% of those rivers is 34. So the total collection of this northern system is 86 million acre-feet of runoff made available. And all that runoff is then brought into this diversion point of the Rocky Mountain Trench. As you can see there is this 500 miles trench. 100 miles of it's already a storage reservoir, but it will be expanded by 400 miles with just 4 new dams. And some of the water will go into that Rocky Mountain Trench, and some of it will go north into the Prairie Canal. You can see here is a breakdown of all the numbers. So the 86 million acre-feet that's flowing south out of those northern reservoirs, then 18 will be diverted up into the Peace River, Lake Williston and the Peace River, and then along a canal, which you'll see in a minute, that will supply the Great Plains. and 68 will be pumped into the trench, and then the Fraser River will add 20.4 to the collection. So we have a total collection here in the trench that's available is 89. And 15 will be diverted for, as you'll see, the California-Oregon extension part of the project, whereas 74 will come out of the trench for the main trunk line of the NAWAPA 21 system. So this canal that I mentioned, the Prairie Canal, it's really created by connecting a series of rivers in the prairie provinces, and excess Mackenzie River basin runoff. Mackenzie River has a runoff of about 240 million acre feet. So the Liard, which was a tributary, and other tributaries such as the Athabasca River, the Peace River, and also the main stream could be brought and bring you, as you saw on the other slide, 33.4 million acre feet, 20% of those rivers, and then adding on the Liard and the collection from the north, we get a total available for this canal to supply the Great Lakes, if there is water available for that. Alberta and Saskatchewan are very dry down here in this area. They need water, so about 20 million acre feet to the prairie provinces of Canada, 20 available possibly to the Great Lakes, and then 10 diverted into the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, and then 10 diverted into the Missouri River for the whole High Plains state. So you can see here that's the breakdown. The Mackenzie River minus the Liard, and then what we're adding from Stewart Lake from the northern collection, 18, and then you can see how we divide that up. And this is another zoomed in view where you can see here Babbian and Stewart Lake, which the northern collection is going to be flowing into. That will just be capable of forming one reservoir system with Lake Williston and going right around Prince George. Prince George is down there. So this canal would go north of Prince George about 40 miles and go around, and then you could pump the water into this Prairie Canal, which I think is mostly gravity flow then south with one pump lift down there. But and here you can see the diversion point. This is the Fraser River running this way, and the northern part of the Fraser River will be dammed, and there will be hot water pumped into there. So this is where the water goes, that way, from Babbian Lake up into Lake Williston and then the Peace River Canal. So I want to look at the main components that this northern collection system makes possible, which is a full integrated plan far developed from the original NAWAPA system in 1964. And I will also just mention that those numbers are recalculated from 2012 data that's been made available. So let's look at these four main components. You have the High Plains area. You can see is this Agala Aquifer region. It's not the states all west of the Mississippi, but it's the states. It's part of the 17 western states. So you look at Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota. These are the High Plains states, and a little bit of East Colorado. That's now factored into the NAWAPA system. That is a new element of the system. Also, all the far left there you see in California. That's an addition to the NAWAPA system. So there's what you have here. You're looking at, if you zoom in on these arrows, you're looking at an integrated system of water made available from multiple locations all at once. And this is the three main systems I want to go through here is this California, what is made possible with the Missouri and the Mississippi River systems, and for the High Plains, and then the main trunk line of the NAWAPA system. And you'll see how these are all integrated as one program. So let's start here. The water that I showed you coming in that Rocky Mountain Trench, 15 was diverted for this plan. So this collection from the north makes possible the water to be put into the Columbia, increase the amount of water that will be flowing through the Columbia, 15 of which will then be pumped into the Deschutes River. and the Deschutes River there in northern Oregon will be pumped 4,200 feet upwards, about 15 million acre feet, which could be increased later on. And that will go all the way to Prineville, Oregon, and then diverted in two ways. One into the Klamath River, completely restoring. You could divert about 5 million acre feet if necessary in the Klamath River. That's about the current flow rate, annual discharge of that river. So we would completely supplement that, but then chiefly 10 into the Northern California water system. And that could be, some of that water could be brought for Eastern Oregon if necessary. So, but into the California water system at the Pitts River, you can see that is going to supply the Sacramento River at Lake Shasta. And then the California water system takes a canal from Sacramento River down into the San Joaquin Valley. So that 10 will be diverted for the San Joaquin Valley and have an enormous impact in supplying this, what's really the Central Valley, if you take the Sacramento and the San Joaquin Valley together. Supplying the food production for the nation. 30% of our produce all comes from that valley alone. So this will permanently bring a supply from the northern water cycle for the foreseeable future for this whole western part. And the next part is something that we added on, is using the Humboldt River, which is this natural winding river that keeps changing places in Nevada. And you can see that in Nevada we would pump out of the Elko reservoir by Elko in the original plan. Just 30 miles you connect to the Humboldt, and that water, about 4 million acre feet, could be brought down into the Owens Valley after supplying western Nevada, northern Nevada, Reno, that whole area, and all the agriculture that goes on out there. And then also water will be brought down into southern Nevada and paralleling the Colorado River before bringing about 12 million acre feet to southern California, Imperial Valley, San Diego, and then that whole stretch along the Colorado River that's used for agriculture. So this main system that was in the original NAWAPA plan, this system, you're bringing water, after you pump it over the Sawtooth Mountains, you're bringing water into northern Utah, a canal that brings water branching two ways, one which I just said, into lake reservoir north of Paperd Peak by the Sheep Mountain Range in southern Nevada, paralleling the Colorado River, meeting up at Yuma and then branching into both Mexico and back up into southern California, the Imperial Valley. But the other branch is the main branch, is, as you see here, an arrow going to be going into central Utah, tunneling under the Wasatch Mountains, and then linking into all the main tributaries of the Colorado River, building a big reservoir 3 times the size of Lake Mead and the Little Colorado River, tunneling then to the Verde River, which is a tributary of the Salt River, building a big reservoir on the Salt River itself, up at the upper reaches of it, tunneling then to tributaries on the Gila River, and finally a big reservoir on the Gila River itself, up at its upper reaches, very close to where this big Baldy fire was a couple years ago, the largest fire in New Mexico's history. So these reservoirs will feed into the main tributaries of the Colorado River. The Gila River is actually not really considered a river by most people there. There's hardly any water in it, and when you drive over, there's nothing there. It's very similar to the Rio Grande and the Pecos River. So these rivers will be year-round annual supply, will be doubling the Colorado River's flow rate with 12 million acre feet, or even actually more. 12 million acre feet estimated to go to Arizona by its alone, but also up in Utah and Nevada and then Southern California. So how much of that will enter into the Colorados to be figured out later. But this whole basin, therefore, will be permanently supplied, more than doubled at the flow rate of the river, but more than that, with the amount be made available to western New Mexico, which is also part of the Colorado River Basin, because it's got the upper reaches of the Gila River. So that whole system will transform agriculture in the most the greatest fertile areas here in the United States. So that will then tunnel under the mountains, the Continental Divide, to go into the Rio Grande Basin. And then after diverting water into the Rio Grande, we'll also tunnel under the Sierra Blanca Mountains to bring water to eastern New Mexico, the Pecos River. And that will supply, Pecos River Reservoir will supply the whole Pecos, which then meets down to the Rio Grande, and Tamaulipas, Coahuila, all these states in northern Mexico, including Sonora, will bring as a total 20 million acre feet a year into Mexico, northern Mexico, solving all of the border conflicts there, all of the issues of jobs, agriculture, and all the poverty that's there, and the whole problems. Everybody knows what it is. So this will bring all that water into the border, the U.S. and Texas, total of about 12 million acre feet, or even more. So 8 into New Mexico, 12 into Texas. So enormous impact for this whole region. And water that's excess of this will be able to be pumped up into Colorado, and you'll see paralleling a system that will also be coming down south. So then we have something really made possible by that Great Lakes Canal, the Prairie Canal that I showed you, where water, both from the northern collection, Alaska, Yukon, and British Columbia, 18 of which will be brought up north into the Peace River Canal, as well as 33, you're going to have a total of 51 coming in, right, for the prairie provinces. But then also for this canal, and also if you wanted to keep the water going, you bring it into the Great Lakes. Although Pierre Gingras, a water exporter designer for Quebec, who has been presenting his material recently, has a plan to bring the James Bay runoff into the Great Lakes. So some of this may not be necessary to go all the way to the Great Lakes if you bring it from that side. But over here, you can link water in now. You see 2 inputs and 3 potential outputs. So what this means is there will be never any flood or drought, basically, all the way from the Mississippi to the west. And this slide makes that point. Because the other ones you saw, these were areas which were largely continuously drought, right? And except Northern California. But these other areas are almost always drought there, so they're going to want that constant supply. But now you're looking at a region which often floods. So what you're looking at is the ability to divert the flood water when there is a flood, and to bring water from those areas out to the west, but also to supplement from the north the ability to continuously divert water, not just in a flood year. So the first is, we look at the top there, Lake Sacagawea. We're bringing water into the Missouri River. And that water will be able to be pumped out of the Niobrara River between Fort Randall Dam and Gavin's Point. Above Fort Randall Dam, you're going to pump water into Niobrara River. And you're going to pump it up 2,800 feet total to, I don't know, at the top elevation there, it's something like 4,500 feet. But the total pump lift is 2,800 feet. And you're going to bring it down, as you can see, right in all the areas of the Ogallala Aquifer, where it's really red, where we've been pumping this water 200 feet down, 200 feet below, where it's really dark red. And this whole areas are just being abandoned entirely. You can't even go there anymore. Just like I forgot to mention, whole areas of California are being abandoned in the San Joaquin Valley because of the salting in the soil as well. So this water, 10 will be brought in annually available from the north. But then on the Missouri River, the design in the 1967, which is added on here, that I located in the Frank Moss Archive, called for about 10 million acre feet annually from the Missouri River to be pumped up this system. So a total of 20 could be made available for the High Plains states annually and for this aquifer system. In addition, water could be in excess after it's delivered to North and South Dakota, brought into the Mississippi River. There you can see via the Minnesota River in southern Minnesota. It leads into the Mississippi River. So last year, when the barges were stuck in the Mississippi, right? We're sitting here dredging our Mississippi River, supposedly the largest, has the largest runoff of any river on the continent, is dry. So this river could be supplemented in times of drought from the north, and is similar, as I said, with the Missouri. But that's an inlet there. The two outlets are three. One, the Niobrara River pump that I went through. Two, lower on the Missouri River, Kansas, right by Kansas City. You're going to pump water. You could pump it up into the Kansas River and go the opposite direction and pipeline it down into Hutchinson, which is right center of the Ogallala Aquifer. So you have a capability of bringing water into central Kansas as well. But also, as you can see, this river here, the Arkansas River, is a river that is then intersected in two ways. One, water that you're going to be purifying to put into the aquifer from the Kansas River, you could put it back into the Arkansas River and it would flow down into the Mississippi River. So you could also, in this canal that's coming from the north, the Niobrara River Canal, and up in Nebraska and going straight down the aquifer, that, if there's a dry year with the Mississippi, you could also bring water into the Mississippi via that canal, just dump it into the Arkansas River. So there's never going to be a drought that's ever necessary again in, as you can see here, Oklahoma, Arkansas, right? Arkansas is not even one of the 17 western states. Missouri, Iowa, all these areas, you're not going to have a drought because you're going to have a constant supply, and eastern Colorado also. So this is this system. The third one is the Texas plan, which may or may not be necessary, frankly, because the Texas plan, the whole idea was to get water to West Texas. Well, we've got water coming to West Texas, don't you worry, right? And people from Oklahoma and West Texas know this is the greatest agricultural area around. This is the flat farmland, perfect if there was water. And the Niobrara River Canal brings water into West Texas, right? A lot of it. So, and then the original NAWAPA system also brought water, enormous amount, into the Pecos River, feeding the whole West Texas border. So while it may not give you water bringing it directly into Lubbock, Texas, which is a big farming area, you're going to get water very close. And so you may not, with this plan now, you can bring water straight to Lubbock. So with the Niobrara plan, the original plan, which is all called NAWAPA 21, we may not need this Texas plan at all. But if we wanted to, we could pump water out of the Mississippi River up into West Texas now that we're bringing water into the Mississippi, and we would ensure that you'd always have a supply. So now I want to look at the nuclear pumping requirements. And nuclear pumping gives us the figures that I went through and puts water that would otherwise just be dumped right back into the ocean to generate hydropower for the pumps, and brings you, which was about 40% of the original water collected, was used to generate the hydropower, and thus makes it available for not just the original system, but makes it easily available for us to bring water into California and Oregon in the north with the California-Oregon extension, but also all this water for the high plains. But I will say that, the original plan made available was enormous. The original plan of 70 million acre feet was more than double the entire flow rate of the Southwest. So that alone does give us a supply, which is the number we're still moving with this plan. But all the excess water from nuclear now makes the other plans completely feasible. The Prairie Canal, supplying the Great Lakes and the Missouri River and the Mississippi River and Northern California and Oregon, all feasible and remaining within 20% diversion of the actual runoff. So the amount now is foreseeable for a time to come. If we need to later on, we'll look at increasing the total supply, which I'll get into in a minute. So I want to point out these main systems of nuclear pumping. You can see the main pump lifts I talked about were up north, but here in the lower 48, the Oregon-California extension, where you're pumping it up 4,200 feet from the Deschutes River through a series of 7 pumps. I don't have slot pictures, I can go through those another time, but you're pumping it all the way into Prineville, Oregon, and then Lake Albert, Summer Lake, around there. It's a total of 4,200 feet. Also the Sawtooth Lift, the main pump system, but pumping up the Niobrara River and then pumping out of the Little Colorado River into the Gila River Basin is another small amount needed. What is the total requirement here? Let's look at this whole system now, and we see that the water that we were talking about collecting, the Taku River, what's available at the Taku River to be pumped into the Stickeen Reservoir, was a total of 52 million acre-feet. We have to pump it up 300 feet, from 2,100 feet elevation to 2,400 feet, and that will require about 2.6 gigawatts of actual power. So we're looking at a few nuclear power plants up there, or more smaller normal nuclear power plants, about 1.2 gigawatts. So if we want to have smaller, we'll have to have more than 3. That water that was collected, which is 54, we ended up then adding more to it, pumping it into the Rocky Mountain Trench, 68.6 million acre-feet, as we went through earlier. That requires 7.9 gigawatts. So we're looking at over 8 or 9 new nuclear power plants up there. And then the Sawtooth Lift, which will be pumping 74 million acre-feet through that, will actually require 31 gigawatts of nuclear power. And therefore, with redundancy you're going to want at that place, we're looking at a lot. Total, if we also look at the Niobrara River, it's a big pump system. If we actually have 20, if we have 10, it'll be 5 gigawatts. If we have 20, as we have here, it's about 9.6. And then the Oregon-California extension, which is a very large pump system up into southern Oregon, is 11. So the total we see is, with this nuclear pumping for the entire system, not letting any water go to waste, right? Putting it all to use. The requirement is about 65 gigawatts, just sheer actual power. Based on the efficiency of the pump system, it's only about 70%. This is going to create the drive to get us into an energy density in the United States to make the breakthroughs we need to in fusion, right? And other technological revolutions that we need to, which will only be available if we really fully apply nuclear power. The idea of using nuclear power to just supply a consumer society, totally insane. But the idea of using nuclear power to just supply the old industries and infrastructure that were possible with oil and natural gas are also an animalistic characteristic rather than mankind. It's like discovering coal and not using it in a steam locomotive, but just using it to make a really hot fire or something to cook your food with. And it's the same thing with nuclear power. There were supposed to be all kinds of technologies that would go throughout the economy. Now, for nuclear power, that we're going to have, as you can see, 70 nuclear power plants. We're going to probably mass produce these with a couple different reactors. And the thing is to just jump to not third generation, which is a slightly improved second generation pressurized water reactor that simply uses the fuel and then dumps out the rods to be stored somewhere, but use the full recycling cycle. So you're getting more out of the collected uranium. And I can go through that more in depth at another time. But the PRISM reactor, as a couple of videos I'll bring up on the screen here, you can watch these interviews we did a couple of years ago with leading nuclear scientists and people who are campaigning for this. The head of Clinch River Breeder Reactor, what was shut down in 1983, Don Riley, he did an interview.
Hazel O'Leary had a charter to eliminate anybody with advanced reactor experience. That was her objective. And obviously, she was trying to eliminate me because I had advanced reactor experience.
DeWitt Moss, who developed he was part of developing the fuel concept for the FFTF, that fast flux test facility, also a breeder reactor concept.
U-238, when you fission an atom of 235, it sends off these 2.5 neutrons on the average. U-238 captures one of these neutrons. Okay? It doesn't fission anything. It just absorbs this neutron and then decays over to plutonium-239. If you love uranium-235 for a fuel, you'll love 239. It is better. Okay, and so that's what the breeder concept is. You can design these cores and use liquid metal because the neutrons aren't slowed down. And in addition to that, liquid metal transfers heat, I don't know, 5 times, 10 times better than water.
These guys, they were looking at, we decided we'd want to go with a design called the Prism, the GE Hitachi Prism, which would be the new, what came out of the Argonne National Labs in 1994 that was destroyed by Congress then, and those who were controlling them, and President Clinton. That design would be, this is called the Integral Fast Reactor, and that would generate all the fuel, recycle all the fuel in the process, and have all the benefits of fourth generation reactor. And that could be mass produced if we decide we want to go with that one. There's other fourth generation reactors.
GE Hitachi has developed a reactor whose technology is based on ERB2. It is called S-Prism, P-R-I-S-M, and its lead engineer is Dr. Eric Loewen, L-O-E-W-E-N. It is a modular reactor so that it can be manufactured and the parts shipped. And it is the most robust design now because of its relation to ERB2. These reactors, because of the modularity and relatively small size, could also power NAWAPA's pumping stations around the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. I should note again, the distance from there to INL is quite small. I believe these projects are America's best hope, especially in avoiding an energy catastrophe in the not-too-distant future.
The efficiency is in the efficiency of the amount of fuel and the heat that's generated, which surpasses anything order of magnitudes. And in that sense, you're looking at the physical costs of nuclear power, and if you take away the artificial costs based on the time constraint of developing it, based on the lack of credit development as occurred in the 1970s with the oil hoax, the huge increase in electricity artificially created in the cost, and then the cost of building the plants based on the credit agreements, extending the time in which it takes to build the plant, and other things, this is the most efficient power that you could possibly imagine. And if we mass produce it, that's going to decrease the cost to build these things, physical cost also, because you're not creating a new reactor every time. All the 104 reactors we have in the United States, you'll notice almost all of them are different. All of them were individually designed due to the insane regulations that were beginning to be slapped around. And so when we mass produce this will be an entirely different idea. And I think it's worth mentioning that while this may seem like a great feat to build 70 new nuclear power plants in the course of 15, 20 years that we want to get them going, probably want to build them actually in 10 years, because we want to take only about 5 years to design NAWAPA. It's worth mentioning that we had 45 nuclear power plants either in operation or built in 10 years between 1957 and 1967. There were 45 plants either in operation or under construction beginning, which all were begun in 1957. So back then we did it in 10 years. We can do more in 10 years now. And so the idea today is mass producing. And it's really a question of willpower. And the desire to assert our own sovereignty is really the question of whether or not this is possible. And obviously if we don't do it, as you can see if you watch the interview we did, we're going to lose the knowledge, the capability, and the ability to carry out this kind of plan and the knowledge that's necessary for the plan. So we're going to choose one or two of these designs, launch this, along with junking the whole empire's restriction on developing nuclear power plants. And the war mobilization of FDR is a good mental image of what this is going to need to gear up and start mass producing nuclear power plants. Because a lot goes into this. And if you add that onto the NAWAPA, if you add that onto the pumping systems, the reservoirs, and the canals and the tunnels, you're looking at a completely new economy, not adding something to an existing economy. You're looking at the requirements mean one, an order of magnitude energy density and power available to drive all of the U.S. manufacturing, but also, and the new transportation systems that will be required. But also just the sheer mass of materials. Just take a point to mention this. Every nuclear power plant is about 300,000 million cubic yards of concrete and 30,000 tons of steel. We can bring a better calculation in another presentation. But so all these, you add up these 70 new nuclear power plants, you can do the math on that. And there's a whole other list of requirements for nuclear power plants I can throw up on the screen. When we look at tunnels, the tunnels required for this plan, 1,200 miles of tunnels moving this much earth. We had one of the gentlemen who worked for the big tunnel boring company, Robbins Company, do a calculation for us. And if you built this plan in 25 years, it would require about 15 tunnel boring machines moving at 3 miles, I think, a year of how much it could dig with 30 diameter tunnels. Some of these diameter tunnels are much bigger, and if we want to do it in 10, 15 years, we're looking at a good 30 to 40 huge tunnel boring machines we're going to need to build for just the old plan, and the new plan has some new tunnels. Or I should say that's probably taking into account the new tunnels. So that's, what's required for that. All the canals, and there's other canals that are not in this map that have to be added on and recalculated, but there was 4,500 miles of canals in this plan, and all of these canals have concrete and concrete lined for the water. Some of them are concrete lined, most of them are concrete lined, and then everything except the if there was going to be a seaway in the prairie provinces, that may not be something we want. That might be old school technology. If we're going to have so many new rail systems, we may not want that. But all the other canals are concrete lined. And then we have so if you look at the total, and also some of the dams that we're not using anymore for hydropower have to be adjusted. So those calculations have to be somewhat redone. But we did this before, and as just to get the actual figures, and what it was back then, about 30 billion cubic yards of earth moved. Right, that's about how much it's going to be, and that's probably still the same because we're adding on all these other parts of it, even if we're removing some of the dams that we don't need for the hydropower. Well, someone should figure out how much earth moved, how much 30 billion cubic yards of earth moved means in manufacturing new earth-moving equipment, and how much power are we going to need for that? Because if we look at the total cement here, million cubic yards of cement, we're looking at a few 100 million tons of cement. What that ends up being when you look at, it's about, if you readjust this to get rid of some of those dams, it's about 1.5 billion cubic yards of concrete, which is about 200 to 300 million tons of cement that goes into that concrete. And that cement, if we can look at the amount of kilowatt hours to make a ton of cement, and then similar with the steel, how many kilowatt hours go into making a ton of steel, and the steel is also slightly less, but probably about the same since we're adding a lot onto this project. We can figure out how many new nuclear power plants we're going to need to add to the grid of the United States, because almost all of our power plants are operating, especially our nuclear plants, are operating at almost max capacity because of the strain on our power grid that we have lack of development And the only thing we've added is coal plants since the 1980s. So all of this, you could figure out how many nuclear power plants we're going to need also just to power the grid to manufacture huge earth-moving equipment, heavy cranes, right? Everything, I can skip to that slide here, but everything that goes into that, all of the tunnel boring machines, all of the nuclear plants and so forth, all the pumping systems, right? And the pumping systems, I forgot to mention, huge pumps. We don't produce those in the United States. Huge 100,000 horsepower pumps. High precision, 20 thousandths of an inch. Aerospace, we're going to need a master plan to get the precision on these pumps. So if we look at our capacity to do that in the United States, these are old figures from 2011. We don't have that many people, and we're probably going to max out because we're looking at, and here you can see all the kind of construction craft jobs, iron workers, electrical workers, switchgear, millwrights, people who fix these machines, pipe fitters, all the people who operate heavy equipment. And then you have machinists, professional engineers. We're going to need probably a lot more people skilled than we even have right now. We're going to max out. Why I say that? Well, in addition to our manufacturing, I say that because the original plan, we're talking about 7 million jobs to build the whole thing and all the manufacturing involved, right? But 10 nuclear power plants, with everything that goes into it, is about 1 million jobs. So here we're looking at 70, right? So we're easily, and then whatever else is necessary to drive our power grid, to drive this manufacturing, high density power. If you were to add 20% of New York City's cars, if you were going to make them electrical, you'd black out New York City. There's not enough power to add a lot to our grid right now. So right now, if we have to add those new nuclear power plants as well. So you're talking about with 70 new nuclear plants, 70 gigawatts for the pumps, and I haven't figured out the exact number, but a whole new array of nuclear power plants for the manufacturing. We may say 10 or 20, maybe more, 30, 40 if we want to replace a bunch of old plants. But there's a lot of jobs here. We're talking at least 7, 8 million jobs just in the nuclear power. So total about 15 million. And if you think of the population of the United States, 300 million, I'm not sure exactly what the workforce is, but do we have 15 million highly skilled people to put to work? That's the question. Earth moving is not low-skilled work. This is also highly skilled. So we're going to have to train a lot of people. It's going to be like a war mobilization, and we're going to have to get all the new technologies involved also, which I have in another slide that I'll go through another time, but all the new technologies in cement, in tunnel boring, even in canals, the new mining techniques. All of this kind of stuff is going to have to be applied to this, new machine tool technologies. So here's our manufacturing we're going to have to gear up, right? And this is, if we look at 4 million jobs to the original NAWAPA, and which involves some of this, and we have all these extra systems, that's why I say about 70 million jobs easy. We don't have a lot of copper, aluminum, steel, cement plants in the United States anymore. Probably going to have to build some new ones. A lot's going to go into that. Foundries, 80% of our foundry capability was pushed out of the United States, just exited in the 1980s. We're looking at foundries are the forming and the rolling of the material. First you have the mining, then you have the milling, but then the foundry is the third step. That's where you shape everything. And machining production, boring, drilling, stamping, all of that, our machine tools in the U.S. are terrible. Power generation grid. So all of this we're going to have to really launch a new level that's required to facilitate a different level of economy. And that's why I want to come to this point here in the conclusion is, and here you can see these are all these jobs, engineering jobs, scientists, all the new science jobs, all the geologists, the mineralogists, people doing the mapping of this new plant for the whole continent, hydrologists and engineers, all the different engineers that are going to be involved, nuclear, rail, civil, electrical. But then also, I said, with the rock crushing at every single place we're pouring cement, mixing it with the cement, all the huge tunnel boring, so forth. All this you can see, you can look at that, big cranes, so on. All of this is not adding to an old economy, right? This is all adding to a new economy. And as if you have this in your mind, we're bringing all this water to areas of farmland, but we're not bringing it to maintain that farm production. Right? We're continuing in the tradition of the sovereign nation state, which, when it applies new discoveries of its own people and new technologies, you're mastering new resources, and you're creating new resources, and you're increasing the power of your territory for your own people. And you're not operating in under any other time constraint. You're not operating on any other kind of time as far as your credit agreements within your own nation. You have at least a relative individual power as your own internal metric, you could say. Your time metric and your own measurement of value, and which is then reflected in your financial system. And that allows you to grow and develop the resources which will improve your own country, right? Which is why people should develop their own capability to have their own manufacturing, as Hamilton's gone through that in detail, and other people have, and I have as well earlier. But this system would give us the ability to create whole new cycles of trade in our country. So you imagine all this water coming in, the new pathways of trade, the new rail systems moving out to the west to deliver this stuff, the new agricultural productions. All of these routes link every state to a different state. Every state is changed. Every state is going to be going from dying to increasing our population, supporting as many people as we can support, and the growth rate, how many children people are going to be having, but this relation between the state, Arizona to New Mexico to Idaho, right? All of these states are going to have a different concept in their head when they think about the state next door. What is this state specializing in now? That's going to be transformed, right? How do I ship goods? That's going to be transformed. What kind of agricultural products is each state creating? That's going to be transformed. Where are the science centers? We're going to have a 30 gigawatt power station either in Hanford or INL, maybe one in each place, right? Hanford actually had a capability to expand to 21 gigawatts when they created it. So we're going to have these science centers conducting experiments with this high power. We're going to have the highest precision pumping systems you ever imagined. And then we're going to have new routes with Canada. Canada is going to have its own sovereign development, finally break from being one of the Queen's Commonwealth areas and fully develop its own resources, break from these limitations, and create its own, as beneficial to the sovereign United States, development of its upper territories instead of just developing along the border. And this development of resources is going to move us up into the Arctic with new mining technologies, new types of minerals, and everything is going to be qualitatively changed. We're moving to a new evolution of the economy. So the new cycles of trade, the pathways, the new types of things, everything's going to be different. So we're building a new economy. And this is, if you look at every one of these steps in U.S. history, before Roosevelt, Washington was hardly even a state. Before the Four Corners Project, what opened up the Southwest, much to the chagrin of depopulation freaks, either willfully or by accident today, created the Southwest, the Hoover Dam, and it created a necessity to completely expand. That power dam alone created everything, and it allowed for the expansion and allowed to drive everything that was down there. The United States was not the same United States before Roosevelt. It was not the same United States before Lincoln at all, right? We didn't even have a full continental system. And before John Quincy Adams, it was similar. There was a completely different level. And I'm going to look at this quote from Nicholas Biddle, who in 1828, after he launched the great internal improvements with John Quincy Adams, organizing the financing of the canal system with John Quincy Adams as president, he at the head of the bank, he was dedicating this canal. And you see the transformation in the concept of the nation. He made the point that every time and space is changed, every legislator who thought they could change the people through making laws was nothing in comparison to that great political institution, the steamboat and its auxiliary canals. And I'll just read here the quote for you. It is thus that these steam vessels, from being merely instruments of trade, rise to the dignity of moral and political power. There is a peculiar fitness, too, that they should owe their origin to this country, for they almost belong to our political system. And he said the greatest problem of the United States was whether we could have a general government that could oversee such an extensive area of land. That was the question, whether you could have that government. Whether limited powers did not require a limited country, and whether the action of a political body so distant could carry a beautiful circulation to extremities. That question is settled. It is no longer deemed necessary to impart a dangerous energy. You don't have to have a Roman Empire to have a huge area. Why? Because of the technology and infrastructure and what it did. And he says here, few things have contributed more to establish that consoling principle than this great political institution, the steamboat, with its auxiliary canals, which measure space by a scale entirely new and have totally subverted the old relations of time and distance. And then he says there was this old English poet who said, what do I care? He said, if I could make the ballads, I don't care who made the laws. And he said in this country, he might have been tempted to add that the legislation of the steamboats and canals was scarcely less efficient than that of the government. So the technological transformation is going to be done through this, right? The massive buildup and applying whole new levels of energy density and technology to every aspect of the industrial process, but also the infrastructure itself being built, transforming the relations, the waterways, the agriculture, the system itself. It's not a question of just water. It's a question of managing. Can you manage the continent? Can mankind act like mankind, not an animal, manage the continent, this whole weather system? But really, a whole system of water management, the whole reservoir system. Imagine managing that system. The effect on the people of Tennessee and the nation in managing a basin is one thing, but managing the whole continent and having scientists collaborating on this plan for the benefit of all nations and managing the resources for that. Now you look at how that is going to create, and us doing it today rather than 1960, is going to create a completely new financial system that we've never created. Because every time we've also launched these developments under these three periods I mentioned, JQA, Lincoln, and FDR, we always use some different kind of credit system, some new application of the sovereign powers of government, some new application of the Constitution to really experiment with the powers that a sovereign nation state is to, in fact, to enact the productive evolution of the economy that's required. So we're going to be creating a credit system, a new American credit system, which has never been applied before. Some of the principles will be the same, but putting this labor force to work, this skilled labor level, putting this skilled labor force to build that plan, to gear up and build this many nuclear power plants and this many other earth-moving equipments in this short amount of time with this labor force means that we may not be able to use conventional methods. So after we wipe out Wall Street, which is really the first thing that would make any of this possible, we're also going to be putting down the Federal Reserve. And we can keep the Federal Reserve districts, but we don't need its old machinery. We don't need its interfacing with all of its member banks in the way that it does. We're going to have a direct credit lending institution bank. And that direct credit institution will be able to create a credit currency where what is circulating based on the proactive, intentional actions by this bank, which will bound the rest of the commercial banks in the country, what's circulating is going to be the credit of the organized intent of government and private sector collaboration. What's circulating is not going to be past wealth that's circulating to consume what's been produced. So instead of parasitical circulation of my representation of my wealth to consume something that's produced, what's circulating is promissory agreements between industries and agriculture and the bank facilitating that process. But the real issue is the value of the currency is going to thus be based on the Bank of the United States. The value of the currency is not based on some idea of intrinsic wealth, past wealth, or the value of money, but it's going to be based on the credit of the Bank of the U.S., in part on the credit of, yes, its actual holdings of U.S. debt and the capital that will be created by the government, new credit created. But largely, it's going to be the simple authority. The Bank of the United States is given authority by Congress, as the Congress in Roosevelt's time authorized these institutions to manage the means of exchange of the country in accordance with Article 1, Section 8. So the bank is given the authority to create the means of exchange and make sure that the means of exchange is a representation of actual intention and the power of the economy. That's what Biddle did. You're leveraging the existing capital, but you're also just creating currency to monetize credit agreements. So this is somewhat of an overview of our reestablishment of the sovereignty of the nations of the North American continent, the development of permanent supply of water, power, and energy and food to vastly increase our populations in accord with the necessity of mankind increasing more people to be able to manage a given area of land at higher energy densities, and also the way in which we will reestablish the United States Constitution and the American credit system. So thank you for taking the time to tune in. And if you have any comments, you can send them into the email at the bottom of the screen and give us your input for developing this program. Thank you.